work on in case we get stuck at any stage on one of the jobs we're working on. So lean is actually something which is fragile, because if we've all got 100 things to sign and one of us, before we pass them on, and one of us goes to the toilet, then we've got the other ones to work on. If we've only got one thing to sign before passing it on and getting the next one, if the person in front of us goes to the toilet, we've got nothing to do. But the way you implement lean can be fragile or anti-fragile. If you rely on an automated system, for instance, we take a flow line system, the classic Ford system. If the system stops for any reason, everything stops. If we rely on lean by perhaps relying on the people and multi-skilling them, so that we can all compensate for each other and all doing the work, and we're working around in a U shape or whatever else and working on the job and passing them through, and we can compensate for each other, we haven't got the problem that a workstation may go down and there's no substitution with it, that we've got human substitution in the process. So another example of that, incidentally, is centralised software systems. If we lock ourselves into the purchase of a centralised system, then the problem we got, of course, is it's actually lean, probably for doing the transactions, but any change in the process at all that we have to do, we're dependent on the vendor of the software. Any interfaces between other bits of software, we're dependent on the vendors of the software. So whilst it is in itself lean, it's fragile lean. Okay? I think cloud is part of the answer to that one. Okay? So my point about this that I'm trying to say is that I think there's fragile lean and anti-fragile lean. Fragile lean is quite naive. It's where we try and get a hardwired system. We have the belief that this will run forever. And when Tony raised before the whole Ford issue, Ford was laying down those production processes at the beginning at times of great stability and a almost infinite market. Cars had never been produced that cheaply. Here was the opportunity, therefore, to enter that market and provide any volume. We didn't have to worry about the fact that 5 years from now we have to make major changes to the line if we were going to be able to carry on, and that actually we were making it very difficult for ourselves by automating the line. We didn't have to think about that. Now, maybe we have to make a major change in a year. So, fragile lean and anti-fragile lean, all right? But lean inherently fragile. Six Sigma is inherently anti-fragile, interestingly, in contrast, because it focuses on variation and dealing with the variation. But again, there's lots of fragile implementations of lean. Oh, sorry, of Six Sigma. So there are lots of hard wires, rigid, learning by rote, automatic use of tools. No judgment in the process, implementations of them. Mistake proofing, like poker yoke, can be either. Right? It's a great anti-fragile aspirational target, and the model, excellence model we talked about, often too much focus on efficiency and effectiveness. Let's just talk about the fragility of lean a little bit further. You see, inventory reduction increases fragility. Just-in-time systems are fragile. Single-piece flow is fragile. Focusing on the value stream and taking out non-value-added activities is fragile. Creating flow, reducing bottlenecks may increase fragility. Focusing on throughput efficiency, minimizing throughput may increase efficiency. Focusing on OEE, maximizing utilization of heavily loading may increase fragility. It may reduce agility, which is therefore going to increase fragility, and so on. You know, everything in the lean model is actually about essentially focusing on increasing fragility if we're not careful. So how we do it is the key point about this. We need to do it in an anti-fragile way. So I won't go through more of that. So what's anti-fragile lean like? Well, it needs to involve continual learning. That will give you an anti-fragile loop. It needs to involve exposure to application in the real world in order to be anti-fragile. So we need to allow for the variation of actual application in the environment. We should not make sudden changes in a system from a non-lean one to a lean one. We should do it progressively. And again, that's a biological thing. Yes, thanks, Jerry. Point taken. So there's quite a lot of things here. The same point, hardwired systems locked in to software systems, for instance, I think are good examples of the fragility of lean. Six Sigma is exactly the same. There's lots of things in the Six Sigma model which in fact cause fragility. And I think the training by rote, historical statistical toolkits, etc., are part of those things. There's some very bad use of software. People take the output from software without actually understanding what it means. And I've seen some terrible examples of that. We're currently working, I should say, I chair MS6, which is the BSI committee with responsibility for Six Sigma and Lean. We're currently working on a new ISO document, which is 8.4 something, which will be a standard, in fact, for Six Sigma and Lean implementation, in which practitioners will be certifiable for the first time, and also the organisations in which they work will be certifiable. And that's about 2 years away at the moment. It's gone through a couple of rounds within the ISO organisation. Now let's talk about this technology thing, okay? Technology and information systems that start robust or even anti-fragile over time will become fragile. Have we established that? All technology dates and it becomes rigid and we need to move around it and it becomes a barrier in a period. So we always have to plan for that, I would suggest. So at most, a technology's anti-fragility is temporary at best. It's anti-fragility, okay? Now, I would argue that we're seeing major problems across everything at the moment caused by the fragility of technology. And one example of that is consumer-facing systems, which we have made changes in the system itself so that decision makers are a long way from the front line, so that we have hardwired systems and now relying enormously on actually user processing. The user's doing most of the processing in those systems. The lumpiness of technology is pretty important as well, isn't it? You see, if you make the wrong purchase decision, you create enormous fragility in the organisation. So that raises issues about decision making as well. Okay? So, you know, all the usual things like benchmarking will help because it will give you some basis for comparison. What about this one? This one's really important. How do you measure anti-fragility? You can't do it on a cost basis because actually the problem is the outcome may well depend on the environmental factors. Innovation is a cause of fragility. We should do incremental. We've talked about those things. Okay. Human decision making can be very, very fragile because a lot of it's irrational. We can't explain it, particularly when it's individual based and not codified. And we rely a lot on that sort of professional decision making. Supply networks are definitely fragile. You gave an example of that before, but the very point that the supply network crosses organisations and crosses countries often these days implies all kinds of additional causes of fragility that we've had before. Information is going to be key to making that, you know, the information flow to make the supply network not so fragile, and sharing and all the sorts of issues. But cost is not a good proxy for fragility measurement because if I make one of the classic inventory decisions, you see, I decide to reduce my stock holding. It will depend on how demand comes in. I can do an expectation. All our optimization normally done on that is done on an average. But with fragility could kill the organisation if the wrong thing happens in the normal background variation. So there's a lot of stuff here. Oh, the environmental aspects and the supply chain aspects are quite complicated, you see. There's probably three things here. The environment and society aspects of the supply chain are related to the anti-fragility in a number of levels. The organisational fragility is affected by public perception of the organisation in relation to society and the environment. Okay. The environment and society and the economy are affected by the organisation in terms of its fragility. And the environmental management system may itself be fragile, just in the way that we talked about the ISO 9000 system. So there's a lot of complicated interrelationships taking place there too, which again, Jerry has indicated, but I don't have time to talk about. Well, I'm up to chapter 7, and I'm doing quite well with chapter 7, so I suppose I should mention aspects. Because products and services have a finite life cycle, and Kodak's a good example of this as well, you would not look for anti-fragility actually on the classical camera, would you? You'd look at it on the portfolio of offerings from Kodak. Okay? So what we should be looking for is the portfolio of products and services rather than the product and service itself should be inherently anti-fragile in the way we put that together. A little bit about public sector organisations being less risk, more risk averse. And we've talked about some aspects of that one before, and so on. Now, I'll cut those, and I want to get to the chase in terms of, and we've talked about this as well, the local and global fragility aspect. If we move all our systems over to cloud ones, with centralised systems based on servers at Google, by and large, we will reduce the incidence of fragility. But when it happens, it'll be much higher impact. Okay, so that's one of the trade-offs we're facing now. Now, what about this then? Our world and fragility. I would suggest that we live in a fragile world in a fragile universe. I would suggest we don't treat the world as fragile, though. Would you agree with me? For instance, you see, we assume that things will go on very much as before. We seem to need to believe in that. For instance, we teach our children in terms of deterministic right and wrong, cause and effect, fundamental laws of nature, historical and assumed to continue things. Is that right? I think that's what we do. All right. Our financial system is based on, what is it, 15th century? I can't remember. 17th century, 15th century. We have a financial system based on double entry bookkeeping, which is based on the merchants of Venice buying things in bulk and selling them in small quantities, which we somehow think is going to be useful to us today in running our organisations, which is very much historic and simplistic. And that's not really about really believing in things changing, is it? We lay down regulations and stuff in relation to the fact we've had abuses on the system, but we don't actually deal with the fundamental postulates far down in the system about human behaviour and take away the opportunity to take risks to your own benefit at the cost, if it goes wrong, of other people. Our engineering is still fundamentally deterministic with little bits of stochastic add-ons possibly in some of the things we do. And the way we understand science, science is anti-fragile. It's based on conjecture and refutation, but not to the public. Science is a set of principles. We even teach it partly in school. Science is a set of principles. They're not. They're just models that we have at the moment of how it works. So we teach everything, we do everything as if it's actually not fragile. And we've talked about that one, about the global circumstances. Now, I think one of the things you need to think about is how do we protect the system here? And we do need some more feedback loops and more control in terms of how we do those protections. And I'm not going to have time to talk about it now, but we'll pick that up later if we can during the discussion. Have a look at this. This is the measurement issue. If you take a process, we can measure efficiency, say through the throughput rate. We can measure fragility through the number of breakdowns or the lost time. We can measure the robustness by the uptime. But to get to the anti-fragility, we need a rate. We need to look at the rate of decline in the number of breakdowns and lost time, because if that's happening, we're becoming less fragile. We're getting anti-fragile. So anti-fragility is always a rate. If we look at people, for efficiency, we've got utilisation or output per head. For fragility, we've got absenteeism and turnover. For robustness, we've got attendance and retention. And for anti-fragility, we'd have something like the rate of decline in absenteeism and turnover. It's a rate again. So anti-fragility is kind of a rate of change in robustness, a negative rate in relation to robustness, all right? And that's why it's so different and so fundamentally different. This is the first time we've gone to the second order, I believe, in dealing with issues inside organisations. See, efficiency isn't really a rate, but anti-fragility is. It's a second order effect. So how do we measure it? Now, one of the interesting things, if you look at this, is that rate of decline in the number of breakdowns and lost time you could do against time, couldn't you? That rate of decline in absenteeism and turnover you could do against time. You could also do some of these measures against stress. If anti-fragility is the rate of decline in fragility over time, it could also be the rate of decline in fragility over stress. The greater the stress you apply to me when I'm exercising, the stronger I become within limits. So we could actually measure it against stress, we can measure it against time. I'm going to suggest in relation to organisations that normally we should measure it against time because it's easy to measure. We could get that into the board. We could monitor that at all times. There's going to be circumstances when we could use the stress in what I'd call red flag conditions. When we know we got a problem, then it will be time for close monitoring, and we could do it against stress level at the board level, for example. Okay? How do we combine all those sorts of measures together? There's various ways you could do it. You could use something like the excellence model to do that, or we could have a specific one for an organisation. Now, I won't bother you with this, but one of the problems you face when you start looking at anti-fragility is our word robust is not enough. Right? What's a robust item? Does it maintain the same strength over time? Or maybe it declines. A lot of our robust items are robust, but they get weaker over time or over stress. Okay? If we think about any engineering idea or equipment, it could be very robust, but over time it gets weaker. All right? So you start thinking about point-wise robustness, which is robustness at any time, and point-wise fragility, ongoing robustness where it stays steady at that level, declining robustness where the robustness drops off over time, and that makes you start thinking about the acceleration rate for anti-fragility that we need to look for. And so these few graphs show that sort of thing. You see the point-wise fragility, as time passes, the fragility, in fact, is going to get bigger and the robustness is going to get smaller. So you can imagine the area under the curve split up into those two things. Anti-fragility and robustness. Now, the robustness over time will be getting bigger with anti-fragility. It will be staying constant with ongoing robustness, and it will be coming down with declining robustness. And the acceleration rate is the rate it does that at. It could be doing it at a fast and increasing rate. It could be staying constant at the rate it changes, the anti-fragility, or it could be at a lower rate. So there's various things that we can start looking at to monitor what's happening in an organisation or a process, based on using the sorts of measures we were talking about there. Okay? So it's not just these things are rates. We can look at how those rates themselves change. It's kind of an acceleration factor in the equation by monitoring the organisation. So there we go. Fragile organisations. How do we decide that an organisation is fragile? In retrospect, it was obvious. But then there's a lot of ones that survived. You know, we could have maybe said BP was due for a problem like that. There's lots of evidence it was. We had lots of complaints from the regulators and all the rest of it. It was pretty obvious it was going to happen sooner or later. But then what about the incidents that didn't happen in the other organisations? Okay? There tends to be a lot of manifestations of fragility, but it's very difficult to judge in advance. My views of fragile organisations, my top 10 things, purely personal, are these. Number one, organisations not worried about fragility are probably the most fragile. Is that fair? Organisations worried about fragility are probably not, because they're worried about it, and they're doing something about it. They're aware. They're joined up. Okay? Not being joined up is a big source of fragility of any sort in an organisation. So where we've got evidence that the organisation is not communicating and aligning its strategy and making things happen in a coordinated way, that's a good example of fragility, latent fragility in the organisation. Knowing things but not doing them. Knowing we had a problem but leaving it. BBC. Right? That's a source of fragility. Doing risk management incorrectly. I'd say that's what everyone does, virtually. They do bad risk management. That's a pretty good source of fragility. Too much emphasis, because you think it's all right, partly as well. Too much emphasis on money and short-termism. We've talked about that at various points. Bureaucracy and emphasis on control. Too much control is an indicator of fragility, I suggest, because it doesn't give you the flexibility, the agility, the ability to change. Badly managing change. Now, you can see those a lot, can't you? You can see organisations that are going through change and making a right pig's ear of it. Weak processes are an emphasis on initiatives, or both. Initiative-itis. We've got a Six Sigma program. We've got a lean program. We've also got a load of problems. Trying to think of the initiative as a solution shows a fragile organisation. Non-transparent decision making. The more transparent decision making is, the more it has to be justified, the more it has to be clear. Generally, the more rational it may be, or at least the stakeholders will have some understanding of it and can hold it to account. But hidden decisions, and Enron's I think is a really good example of this. The board had no idea what was going on, right? And partly because of internal audit, because of audit, right? Naive offshoring, ignoring customers. I'd leave that one on the end. I was trying to find a 10th, I'll be honest, and the two bits are quite separate. But you see, naive offshoring is one of those cost imperative things, but led to all kinds of problems. The car industry went through horrendous problems because it just went for offshoring without really understanding